We're going to get started with the second of our three panels for our agenda today. For those I don't know, my name is Jared Duvall. I'm EAN's Executive Director, and I'm really honored to be introducing and moderating this panel of statewide leaders to help give us a sense of, we're moving from the federal lay of the land, what's happening, looking ahead to now, in the second half of the day, looking at the state landscape and the priorities of state leaders in the administration, statewide offices in the legislature. We'll hear from this afternoon to get a sense of what those priorities are, what the gaps, barriers, and opportunities are for our work together, and again, the chance to ask questions of these folks. So just a reminder, we have cleared the questions that you asked from the first panel, but you can ask questions at the very same Slido.com app with that code that is on your agenda, or use the QR code. So as questions come up for you in this panel and in the third panel this afternoon, you can put your questions there, upvote questions from others, and we'll then pose them to our panelists. So I am now going to introduce our three panelists. We're going to hear first from Gavin Boyles, who is the Deputy Treasurer of the state of Vermont. He has served in that role since 2023. And prior to serving as Deputy Treasurer, Gavin was the General Counsel at the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation, which regulates banks, insurance companies, and securities professionals. He has also worked as an attorney in the Environmental Protection Division of the Vermont Attorney General's Office and in private practice, and he lives not far away here in downtown Montpelier. After Deputy Treasurer Boyles speaks, we'll then hear from the Chair of the Public Utilities Commission, Ed McNamara. Chair McNamara was appointed in January of 2024. He had previously served as General Counsel of the Agency of Natural Resources, where he worked on a wide range of legal issues reflecting the significant regulatory diversity that's covered by ANR. And prior to his work with the Agency of Natural Resources, Chair McNamara he's worked on energy issues for 20 years. I think everybody in this room knows of Ed and has worked with him or knows of his work, including at the Public Service Department, where he served in many roles, including as Planning Director and assisting with emergency response activities and representing Vermont's interests before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. Chair McNamara actually started his legal career as a hearing officer and staff attorney for the PUC, so he's kind of come full circle. And then finally, we're going to hear from the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, Julie Moore. And as many of you know, the Agency of Natural Resources has primary responsibility for protecting and sustaining Vermont's environment, natural resources, wildlife, and forests, and for maintaining Vermont's beloved state parks. Secretary Moore was named to lead the Agency of Natural Resources by Governor Scott in January of 2017. And she, in that role, shapes Vermont's environmental agenda, focusing on climate action, water quality, the forest economy, and the importance of conservation. Before her appointment, Secretary Moore worked both as an engineering consultant and spent 5 years leading Vermont's efforts to reduce phosphorus pollution in Lake Champlain. So we're going to hear from each of them for about 10 to 15 minutes of remarks. They may speak at the table or come up here, and then after we've heard their priorities and the work that they're currently doing and looking ahead to in 2025, I will look to the Slido app to pose your questions to them, and we'll engage in a conversation. So with that, Gavin, please.
Thanks so much. Really great to be here on behalf of the Treasurer's Office. Treasurer Pichak sends his regrets. He's had some long-awaited travel that he's doing. But great to be here and great to see so many familiar faces from both this current role and prior roles. So I think all of you probably know at this point that the Treasurer's Office has been, in the last couple of years, placed in a sort of coordinating role with respect to climate finance, resilience, infrastructure finance, and in that role, we are trying to accomplish a few different things. So let's see if this works. Great. So our overall goals, this is all pretty broad-based, but number one, ourselves to be aware of potential and actual funding sources to raise awareness of them, among others, to publicize them. On that note, I'll mention for this group that on our website, which is, I forgive you if it's not a frequent surfing destination in your web travels, but we do have a matrix of about 80 or 90 different programs that we put together with a lot of assistance from the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission and the League of Cities and Towns, I believe. So I'd recommend making your way over there if that is of interest, and we'll try to keep that updated as well as time goes on. The next one, provide a clear-eyed view of long-term fiscal opportunities and liabilities and risks. That is something we try to do with respect to the entire Treasurer's book of business, not just climate, not just infrastructure, but this legislative charge has really allowed us and encouraged us to broaden our view, to include those things and to really focus on them with a number of partners, including principally the Agency of Natural Resources with Secretary Moore, and we'll hear more about those partnerships later in my remarks and also from Secretary Moore. So in that second bullet, I wasn't here this morning, but some of those risks and liabilities that we are now considering much more closely are obviously risks and liabilities relating to federal programs, federal funds, and so that that will come as no surprise to anyone that is a renewed area of focus for us. Number three, mitigate fiscal risks, financial risks to Vermonters and to the state. So two very related things, obviously, and climate hits all of them, as we've all seen with the most obvious example being the recent floods and their damage to infrastructure and people's homes, businesses, local economies, and other aspects of the state's economy. And then last, and I think I might focus on this one a little bit more than I would otherwise, just because it's something that I think is maybe a little more unique to the Treasurer's Office viewpoint among those in this room, which is to advocate for prudent budgeting, investing, and reserving practices. And I want to talk particularly about a project that we're working on that was given to us by the legislature, which we encouraged them to give to us, which is a study of the state's budget reserves and what's called stress testing, fiscal stress testing, which is just what it sounds like. So this is sort of a list of our current projects that touch on sort of climate infrastructure and more broadly sort of things that I, in my limited view of EAN's scope of business, what I thought might be of interest. So we are a partner in the Resilience Implementation Strategy and Resilience Implementation Working Group with the administration, primarily working with the Climate Action Office at ANR and with Secretary Moore and her team. We are, and I think, as part of that, I think the most sort of public part of that for the Treasurer's Office is that by, I believe, July 1 of 2025, we are charged under the current statute to come up with essentially a price tag of climate adaptation in the state. I won't spend a lot of time on those because I think those are more, there's more overlap with others on those. I'll mention this 2.5% for climate. The Treasurer's Office has for years had the authority to essentially establish lending facilities with up to 10% of the state's cash balance for broadly economic development. This 2.5% for climate resilience and infrastructure lending was new last session. It's something that we brought to the legislature. We're really pleased that it passed. Essentially gives us authority to lend for those limited purposes over and above the existing 10%. And just to give you some idea of the scale of this, the state's current average cash balance is probably somewhere in the $1.6 to $1.7 billion range on any given day. So we take a kind of conservative view of what 2.5% of that is, but somewhere in that kind of $30 to $40 million range is likely the scope of this lending facility, and we administer that lending through our office. We were able to use that authority to do some very quick lending after the floods through the bond bank. I think it was $10 or $15 million that went to municipalities that enabled them to save a lot of money on interest rates they otherwise would have had to pay in the commercial market. So really trying to look creatively at what we can do with this authority. So that's my invitation to you, and that's Treasurer Pichak's invitation, is if there are lending opportunities and needs out there in the world that you think we should be aware of that would fall within this, we'd love to hear about them. You can contact me directly. It's just my name at vermont.gov anytime. Some others. So I've mentioned the 10% in Vermont, and part of what I'll say about that is we just sort of refocused it a little bit when we came into office in 2023 to include an express focus on kind of climate resilient economic development projects. So what has that meant? We've done some sort of climate specific projects, like I believe there's a solar project in there. We've also focused on sort of infill housing development. There's been a big focus on housing, and our focus has been that those investments not be sort of sprawl investments, that they be affordable, that they be infill. In many cases, they've been senior housing as well. And I think that those sorts of investments do fulfill our mission of being more climate resilient and enabling the state to be more climate resilient. The Municipal Technical Assistance Program is a program that we have advocated for funding for, that I'm sure most of you or many of you are more familiar with it than I am, but provides technical assistance in applying for federal funds, for example, to small towns and municipalities in particular. And there's, I believe we have some ongoing discussions right now about future funding for that. But it's a real kind of force multiplier type investment, so we think it's a good one. Mentioned 10% in Vermont. So budget reserves and stress testing report. This is my opportunity to tell you that, broadly speaking, the state of Vermont's finances are healthy. We do have some pension obligations that we are paying down that, continue to be sizable, but there is a plan in place that's been followed for 15 years now, and 15 years to go, and that will be, much less of a drag on the budget. We have healthy budget reserves in a variety of realms, so the state is pretty well positioned to respond to future climate events. Having said that, no great insight to say that it's difficult to say what the scope of those events will be and what the cost of those events will be. So we have a report due on January 15th to the legislature that will contain our recommendations about any changes to the state's reserving practices and any changes to the state's stress testing practices. And what a stress test is, and the reason I raised it here is because, one of the things that a stress test could include is sort of a future climate disaster and what it means for the state's budget in particular. So more to come on that. That'll be on our website, January 15th. We are involved in a, similar to our role in the RIS and with respect to estimating climate damages. We are a partner with A&R on Cap and Invest and what's been called the Climate Super Fund, or Make Big Oil Pay. Our role in those sort of comes a little bit down the road from some preliminary, more technical work that A&R is doing, but our role there, similarly to estimate damages. We've been doing some ongoing work with the Vermont Pension Investment Corporation, or Commission, I apologize, with respect to decarbonizing the pension portfolio. So that represents, I think, $7 or $8 billion of funds that we hold in trust, and VPIC holds in trust, for Vermonters who are in the state employees, teachers, and municipal retirement programs. As you all know, nationally there are this is an example of just growing and increasingly entrenched polarization politically in terms of how pension funds should or should not react to the climate crisis. VPIC has for years been a leader in attempting to decarbonize their portfolio, and doing that with a view to essentially the UN goals of net zero by those UN dates. So that is ongoing. It's sort of administrative work, but VPIC definitely welcomes input on it, as do we. And then let's see, the last one I'll just mention really quickly, the Municipal Equipment Loan Fund, to the extent folks are here from municipalities or regional planning commissions or anything like that. This is sort of a little known but below market loan fund that we administer in the event that new municipal equipment is needed. We had a couple of instances where municipal equipment like fire trucks were damaged in floods, and we were able to provide pretty quick below market loans for that. So that is, I think, where I'll leave it, and more to come on several of these topics from Secretary Moore.
Good afternoon, folks. All right, so Ed McNamara, and just so folks are aware, a little bit of a disclaimer, I am one of 3 commissioners, so anything particularly stupid I say today can potentially be fixed by the other 2 commissioners down the line. So I represent only myself here, not all 3 commissioners. So I'm going to jump around quite a bit, but start first with Clean Heat Standard. So enacted about a year and a half ago. And in roughly 6 weeks, we have, due to the legislature, some proposed rules. We have to say who is obligated under the Clean Heat Standard, what their obligations are, an economic impact analysis, and a check-back report as well. Farther down the line, we have a default delivery agent, their 3-year plan and budget. We have to approve that by September 1st, 2025. And I also want to note that there's Act 18 created the Equity Advisory Group and the Technical Advisory Group. This is a list of folks who've done a lot of really hard work over the last year and a half or so, independent of the commission. So again, if we do something that you don't necessarily agree with, it doesn't mean that the EAG or the TAG got anything wrong. So appreciate all the work that they've been doing. And sorry, I just sort of jumped right into clean heat standard, assuming most folks have actually heard about that, generally familiar. I think that's fair. So October 1st, we issued draft rules. This was required under the statute. We actually had to propose some draft rules. There's definitely some miscommunication or confusion about this. Our rules are never program design. So what we put forward was actually a document that said, obligated parties, this is what you have to do. It did not spell out the entire clean heat standard, how we would implement it, anything like that. And so we tried to explain that in a companion status report, where we also talked about where we're at in the overall process, what we still need to get to. I think the point that's probably more interesting for folks is in that status report, we also flagged that we actually had a different idea. It's not a new idea, it's one that we actually came up with in 2021, I believe, Act 62, when the PUC at the time was tasked by the legislature looking at how to address thermal sector. So we put that forward again and said, look, we understand we're developing a clean heat standard. You told us to do it. We will develop a clean heat standard. We're going to have one ready for you on January 15th. But we think that there is a simpler process, and that's a thermal energy benefit charge. Essentially, it would be very similar to the electric energy efficiency charge or VGS's energy efficiency charge. It's a charge on the bill. It's very clear. And we raise the bill, or sorry, the charge is set based on a budget that's also set by the PUC. So what we recommended is instead of clean heat standard, just get money we just collect money and then give it to the appropriate entities. One significant piece that we realized though is that does not help with biofuels. The EEUs, VGS, Efficiency Vermont, low-income weatherization, they all know how to do weatherization. They know how to incentivize heat pumps. To date, none of them have been involved with biofuels. So that's a core piece that would need to be changed going forward. Excuse me. So why did we actually propose a potential alternative? When we talked to the weatherization assistance providers, when we actually talked to the folks who are going out to do low-income weatherization, their reaction to clean heat standard was, we actually don't care about this. What we need is money. We need a predictable funding source that's sustainable in the long term. We also looked at the WAPs and the EEUs. They have a great track record of when we provide them with a budget, when we provide them with a funding source, they're able to get really good work done. The other advantage, at least in my mind, is that clean heat standard, it's a market-based, performance-based mechanism. It also is more complicated than the existing EEUs, at least the initial setup. So this approach of simply collecting money, giving it to the EEUs, giving it to low-income weatherization providers, significantly lower administrative costs, and also has the increased transparency. We do a budget setting process, so we know how much this is costing people every year. And then the last piece as well, which I already hinted at, for a market-based program, you have to look at, excuse me, the size of the Vermont market. We're really small. So to be able to establish and administer a market that deals with 100 plus obligated parties, however many installers you have out there, and with the number of clean heat credits, it's complicated and it's going to cost money and time to set up and run. So, want to flag a couple issues, excuse me, for the legislature. First is public input. One of the things that surprised me when I got to the PUC, essentially we were told to develop a clean heat, or to design and implement a clean heat standard, and then go out and do public engagement. We're already told what program to develop, so the public engagement felt kind of hollow, I'll be honest. And so if the legislature decides to move forward with clean heat, strongly suggest that they get a lot of public input in the process. Another issue that came up, excuse me, I don't know if it's allergies or what in here. The scope of the clean heat standard. One of the open questions based on the law, is it just fuel dealers or is it anybody who imports non-transportation fossil fuel into Vermont? That includes, in that latter category, you have hardware stores that sell propane. So should be a relatively minor fix, but should just make sure we understand the overall scope. Role of biofuels. When we had a public hearing on this, about 80 people showed up. It was actually our largest public hearing since sort of the wind projects from 10 years ago in terms of number of participants. About half the commenters talked about biofuels and specifically suggested that biofuels should not be included in the clean heat standard. That's an enormous impact on the clean heat standard, both in terms of total costs. Biofuels are likely to be one of the lower cost options for any obligated party. And also just the scope of what can obligated parties provide. So PUC is really good at, we're a bunch of energy economic nerds. We're not great at doing health effects of particulate matter. We're not good at looking at biomass availability and carbon cycle. So any discussion about the role of biofuels necessarily involves ANR, sorry Julie, not trying to throw you under the bus, and Department of Health. And I'd suggest that there should be a long-term or a significant discussion, and the legislature should decide this is the path that Vermont is going to go down when it comes to biofuels. Make a decision and just decide which curtain you're going to go behind. All right, jumping around a little bit again. So, electric sector, excuse me. Just want to provide some basic principles and facts here. Electric rates are cost-based, and the PUC is required to allow utility recovery of reasonable costs. What that means in practice is that electric rates are regressive. So whenever you look at electric ratepayers as like, oh, here's a great source of funding for any particular issue, keep in mind is regressive. It's a regressive funding source as opposed to general fund, which is progressive taxation. Another important consideration is the power supply and how that relates to greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, about 86% of Vermont's power supply is non-fossil fuel. Pretty significant component of that is nuclear. The rest is renewable. So under the recently amended RES, we have to be 100% renewable by 2035. So this is important. According to Vermont's greenhouse gas inventory, which is linked to GWSA, the GHG emissions in the electric sector are based on the power supply. In other words, the renewable energy standard requirements. They're not based on, or the GHG emissions have nothing to do with the number of generation facilities in Vermont. That's actually irrelevant when it comes to the GHG inventory and GWSA. And further, if there are excess renewable energy credits, excess RECs, utilities are obligated to sell those excess RECs out of state to reduce the costs of RES. So in other words, GHG emissions are linked to RES requirements, and any excess RECs don't do anything for Vermont's GHG mitigation. Just wanted to give a sense of the scope. This is from the most recent GHG inventory. So electric sector is 2.6% of Vermont's emissions. So tied for fourth I'll say that instead of fifth. So tied for fourth with waste, well behind thermal sector, transportation, and agriculture. So this slide is really about how I think about the intersection of utility regulation, electric sector, and GHG emissions sort of going forward. And this top slide or top quote is actually from the Climate Action Plan. And I think it encompasses fairly well the intent, which is focus to maintain progress made in the electric sector to ensure cost-effective backbone for significant transition necessary to decarbonize. So we need to keep that in mind as well. The electric sector is the enabler. Without a good, strong backbone, we're not going to be able to decarbonize. We can't do EVs, we can't do heat pumps, which leads me to this next point. I've heard in various public comments of, we can't make this transition, Vermont's grid can't handle it. We can't handle the number of EVs, we can't handle the number of heat pumps. That's just wrong. We're not going to get the number of EVs overnight. We're not going to get the number of heat pumps overnight. We can see it happening over time. We can build out our transmission grid, our distribution sub-transmission grids. It's going to cost money, and how we design it is going to be important. Rate design is going to help, trying to encourage usage during the time the sun shines, EV charging during the day as opposed to switching for off-peak EV charging into the middle of the night. There's things that we can do to minimize cost. There is going to be some cost, though, and that is going to factor in the cost effectiveness of heat pumps and EVs. Excuse me. All right, 2 more slides left. Very quickly, last year we were tasked with 2 legislative reports. First one is coming up with a regulatory structure to support development and permitting of thermal energy exchange networks. So, and along with the providers. This is something that we're just starting now. We just opened a case number in EPUC. Happy to talk to folks about how to get into that system. We're looking for comments in March, and we'll have a report to the legislature on how we should do essentially geothermal networks. Energy cost stabilization is also probably a more significant study in terms of scope. Basically look at reducing stabilizing costs for low, moderate income households. And the preface for a lot of this discussion on the energy cost stabilization study is the recognition that we're transitioning from gasoline, the cost of gasoline, the cost of fuel oil, and the cost of electric to centralizing everything into electric rates. We don't have the same low-income support programs in the electric sector that the thermal programs have. There isn't currently anything in the transportation sector that I'm aware of, at least. So essentially, as we concentrate costs into the electric sector, how do we help ensure that low-income Vermonters are not left behind? And then we have to consider development of a statewide program as well. Last piece, Jared asked me to specifically talk about siting generation facilities, and suspect this might come up during the legislative session. So Title 30, Section 248 requires that the PUC find that any particular generation facility promotes the public good of the state. So we have a list of criteria that we look at. This is largely a construct. Section 248 was first written probably 80 plus years ago is my guess. It's actually hard to follow it that far back. But it's from a time when generation was built by the utilities, was built for needed reliability to provide power. Important considerations on 248, municipal zoning doesn't apply, and appeals of the PUC decisions go directly to the Supreme Court. This is very different than pretty much every other land use regime in the state, where you have Permits of appeals often go to the environmental court, and then from the environmental court up to the Supreme Court, often remanded back and then back and forth. So part of the reason that we have a lot more solar facilities in the state than affordable housing, because we have an incredibly streamlined process for this. So we have more than 500 megawatts of solar that have been permitted in most of that in the last 15 years. More than 10,000 separate facilities. A large number of those are actually just registration. You just go online on PUC's website, fill in a form, press enter. You pretty much have your certificate of public good right then. So anything under 15 kilowatts, basically the roof size, incredibly simple process. Once you start getting into the larger projects, we have it's less streamlined and can take a while. Not as long as a lot of other land use activities, but takes longer than a registration. So, yep, that's all I've got now. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I suspect this is a function of me only getting my slides to Kara at 30 this morning. Sorry, again. Can I hit anything on this, Kara, to be helpful? All right. There it is. Ooh, it's like fancy old-timey font. Dot matrix printer. The slides are literally as boring as that screen you've just seen, so I'm not sure this is worth waiting for, but we'll go for it. So I'm going to talk about 4 different bodies of work that are currently underway at the agency. The Global Warming Solutions Act, but most specifically the work underway to update Vermont's Climate Action Plan, the Climate Superfund bill, the Resilience Implementation Strategy, and then the Cap and Invest work, all of which Gavin touched on briefly. So in terms of the Global Warming Solutions Act, as folks may recall, we adopted Vermont's initial climate action plan in December of 2021, and we are now moving into periodic updates, the first of which needs to be adopted by the Climate Council come July 1st of next year, and then we'll get on a 4-year rolling approach to updating the climate action plan. This is a rather significant update, I would say, for 2 reasons. One is it's the first one, and we had a little over a year to build the first climate action plan. So the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed by the legislature in September of 2020. You may remember there was also a global pandemic in full force at that point. The Climate Council had its initial meeting in November of 2020. And come December 1st of 2021, adopted a plan. So certainly some loose ends and opportunities for improvement, but also in recognition of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements that are established in the Global Warming Solutions Act. There's a very aggressive target for 2030, and the plan we adopt in 2025 needs to be sufficient to meet the 2030 emissions reductions as per the current law. So this includes initiatives, programs, and strategies. A lot of incentive-based initiatives were front and center in the original climate action plan. But it also can include rulemaking, and there's sort of a don't pass go, don't collect $200, A&R shall adopt and implement any rules that are identified in that climate action plan. And we have just 12 months to do that work once the plan is complete. The work we're engaged in right now is really being led by subcommittees to the Climate Council, and it is significant. Jane Lazarchak, who heads our Climate Action Office, is here, and I know is regularly fielding concerned calls from the volunteers that are leading these subcommittees about the challenge they feel to accomplish the magnitude of the work required. And I would also just reflect, it's been really hard as a group, as a council of 23, to set priorities throughout. Our initial climate action plan identified more than 260 high priority strategies. There's no way to work on all of those simultaneously, and without setting some priorities, it becomes very challenging to have a shared vision for what implementation success looks like. And then also just flag that the Global Warming Solutions Act, in establishing the greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, hitched our cart to the Paris Climate Accords and some of the UN dates, but did not consider Vermonters' ability to pay or afford that transition. So shifting gears, the Climate Superfund is a piece of legislation that was passed last session by the legislature, and it authorizes the state to recover damages from fossil fuel companies for things that can be ascribed to the impacts of climate change in Vermont, with the idea that funds recovered would be put towards adaptation projects. So there's a couple of different bodies of work that are part of this Climate Superfund bill. The first is looking at attribution. Who's responsible for what? We are limited by the US Constitution in only being able to consider entities with a relationship to Vermont. So Saudi Arabia's oil company may not have that direct nexus with Vermont, but we have a way to work through that. We're looking at all of the greenhouse gas emissions during the period of record for this bill, which is 1995 to 2024. And then there's a second set of work once A&R completes its work in the attribution side of the house, where the Treasurer's Office will engage and start to look at some of the costs. In terms of schedule, we need to have finalized our rules that explicitly show how we would lay out this attribution science by January 1st of 2027, so about 2 years from right now. You have to roll back the calendar, though, because our rulemaking process generally takes about a year. We expect this one to receive significant scrutiny. And so it really means we need to have those draft attribution rules ready just about a year from right now. And then the law anticipates we will send cost recovery letters to the big oil companies within 6 months of adopting the rules, so by mid-2027. Working with the Treasurer's Office, we did issue a request for information in July of this year and specifically asked experts to share with us their thoughts about different approaches for attributing and allocating damages, and then how we might turn that into an estimate of the damage caused by greenhouse gas emissions. We received 6 responses. I would say 4 of them were on topic. We had a couple of others. And there's a lot of good information in there, and technical staff at both A&R and the Treasurer's Office are kind of sifting through that right now. There were clear demonstration of approaches that are able to connect the emissions of individual actors to damages at the national level, which was great. One of the pieces that's tougher, though, or is missing in that space is that while there's a methodology, it's most well developed when we're thinking about the impacts of heat. Obviously, flooding is sort of Vermont's largest climate risk factor or climate hazard. And so while in principle, we know that that approach is likely to be able to be applied to flooding, it hasn't been done anywhere yet. The other piece is it was what wasn't in the responses, which is they didn't have a lot of suggestions on how to actually estimate adaptation costs, which is one of the things required by Vermont's Climate Superfund bill. We have a feasibility report that is due back to the legislature on January 15th. I would flag the legislature in passing the bill appropriated $600,000 last year. I don't think that's going to be anywhere near sufficient for the analysis that we are going to need to conduct and do it in a way that will withstand the legal scrutiny that's sure to follow. Also, some questions about the timeline depending on the scope of the work that remains ahead, including novel work, I would argue, around flooding. The resilience implementation strategy is, again, a shared effort between ANR and the Treasurer's Office, and it seeks to guide and prioritize the work that's being done throughout state government to help build landscape-level resilience here in Vermont. And it's intended to complement both the State Hazard Mitigation Plan and the work in the Climate Action Plan that specifically focuses on rural resilience. We gave ourselves a self-imposed deadline also of July 1st of this year, so again, trying to match it up with the Climate Action Plan. And Climate Action Office staff has really been lead on this and is currently doing a couple of different things. The first is finalizing a vision statement for this work. They've already gone out, done some initial public engagement, are building a vision statement based on what they've heard, and look forward to putting that back out for public comment, I think, before the end of the year. The other piece is what they've termed an opportunity assessment, and this is compiling existing state-led programs that have some sort of connection to climate, and specifically to resilience, looking at ways we might tweak or adjust those programs to maximize their impact in terms of resilience, and then also identifying remaining gaps. Good news is we so far have collected 300 different programs throughout state government that have strong connections to climate resilience. In ANR, this looks like things like conservation and land management. There are funding and regulatory and incentive programs across probably a dozen agencies, as well as technical and education efforts. And we know that there are tools and data sets that we use in our work that also will have real value to helping Vermonters plan for climate change. Just a few of the high-level takeaways from the opportunity assessment to date. The importance of cross-departmental and cross-agency collaboration. The one that's flagged up here is the Vermont Center for Geographic Information, which exists in the state's Agency of Digital Services, the UVM Spatial Analysis Lab, or SAL, and the State Emergency Operations Center all have remote sensing technologies, but don't all always know what each other's doing in the throes of an emergency. Some of you may be familiar with the work that Dr. Chen initiated when he was at the Vermont Department of Health called Health in All Policies, where it asks all state agencies to bring a health lens to their work. I would call this climate in all policies, right? That there's an opportunity as state agencies are going about their business to be very intentional in considering ways to bring resilience into those efforts. Making sure that we're thinking about all hazards is another piece that's come up. Obviously, flooding is front and center, but there are related components to that, carry-on effects that we need to be aware of. The one that's flagged up here is invasive species management. For folks that are concerned about riparian habitat and, frankly, riparian area stability, the enormous distribution of Japanese knotweed that occurred following Tropical Storm Irene has been destabilizing of some of those resources, and looking for ways post-disaster to try and check that. Again, that shared tools and data sets, making sure we're working at the right scale. A lot of the work that needs to happen is watershed-based, and yet most of our partnerships tend to be municipalities or RPCs. And then formalizing programs to address the economic impacts of climate change. There have been several ad hoc initiatives. The BGAP program administered by the Agency of Commerce and Community Development may be at the top of that list, but those are absolutely one-off being pulled together in the days following an emergency right now. And then the final piece I will touch on is the cap and invest work. Last year's transportation bill directed ANR, working in partnership with VTrans and the Treasurer, to evaluate a cap and invest program and a low carbon, or sometimes called a clean fuel standard. And the idea of a cap and invest program is it sets that limit or cap on greenhouse gas emissions, and it declines over time. The state auctions allowances up to that cap, and those auctioned allowances generate revenue that we can then turn around and invest in programs to increase the availability of or subsidize the cost of reducing emissions. Low carbon fuel standard sort of has a theme and variation there. It sets a declining limit on the rate of greenhouse gas emissions from those fuels, and then fuel distributors or other regulated entities need to meet certain targets that, again, decrease over time. The agencies, as we started this work, this was really focused on transportation. we decided to expand our evaluation to look not just at the transportation sector, but also at all fuels, so economy-wide. Recognizing in all fuels cap and invest would be an alternative to the clean heat standard. And then the final step of this is the Treasurer needs to recommend viable options to the General Assembly by mid-February. So we provided a status report to the legislature the middle of last month. Some of the initial considerations identified in that status report I've laid out here. The assumption that Vermont's going to link to another existing program. There are two of it, well, there's one of them that's out there and one of them that's widely anticipated. The Western Climate Initiative, which is California, Washington, and Quebec's efforts. And then the New York Climate Initiative, which isn't yet established, but understand that New York is likely to make a decision about if and how to proceed late this year or early next year. Would flag that the Washington Climate or Western Climate Initiative has a relatively high price ceiling in that it's been in place for quite a while, whereas New York's Climate Initiative is expected to set a lower initial price ceiling. This is important for a couple reasons. If we were to link with WCI, we'd have to come in where they're at. We don't have any ramp-up period. And while a lower price ceiling means less impact on the price of fossil fuels, it also means less revenue generated and less certainty of meeting the emissions reduction requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. There's a lot of uncertainty on where these price caps will go. But one thing is more certain, Vermont's not really going to drive, right? In either instance, there are far more people and emissions occurring in New York or in the combination of California, Washington, and Vermont, or Washington and Quebec than we will have. And so we are unlikely to have any meaningful effect on allowance prices. The report also flagged that no neighboring state is currently pursuing, or currently has, I guess I should say, that's incorrect on my slide, a low carbon fuel standard, which means the administrative burden for such a program would fall to Vermont. We did note that New York and Massachusetts both are considering such legislation, though. And then finally, as folks should be aware, Vermont adopted the Advanced Clean Cars and Clean Truck Standards. We're one of 10 states that signed on to that. But it does have some impact on the additional benefits from a cap and invest approach for transportation only. And then just a few closing thoughts as we jump into the question and answer part. One is just a reflection that transitions both take time and cost money. Seems like it could go unsaid, but sometimes I feel like it's missed. I do have some concerns that our current approach feels a bit like throwing spaghetti at the wall. We have a clean heat standard, a thermal energy benefit charge, a cap and invest, a low carbon fuel standard, and appreciating the sense of urgency that all of those things reflect. That is an incredible amount of work that a relatively small number of state agency staff are deeply engaged and invested in. And it's hard to do all of those big complicated things well. I think we do need to take what we've learned and move quickly and intentionally from what are aspirational goals to things that are actionable. And to me, that means being clear-eyed and seeing Vermont as a small state. That means we have a limited taxpayer base, workforce, and administrative capacity, and somehow have to balance those things against the mandates in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And then really feel strongly that there needs to be a focus on durable and affordable program designs that really brings the public along, very much echoing Ed's comment that the clean heat standard was sort of designed and then put out to the public, as opposed to engaging the public in the design of things that are going to have so many implications for their day-to-day lives.
Thank you all for sharing those remarks with everyone. I see that there are many questions in the Slido app. Please, if you're not already in there, feel free to go in and upvote. Maybe I'll go down the line with some specific questions for each of you and then focus on some broader questions that multiple folks may want to address. But starting with...
Do you want us to grab the other microphone up there? So you want to put it?
That's great. So starting with Deputy Treasurer Boyles, the top question right now is that California voters recently approved a large bond for climate projects. Is this something that Vermont could do?
Sorry, is that on? Yes. It is definitely something that Vermont could consider. Excuse me. We have a capital debt affordability advisory committee that historically has met once or twice a year that advises the treasurer's office on sort of the prudent scope of bonding. And, having said that, I'll just mention a couple of other, considerations in that space. As everyone knows, Vermont has a tremendous and somewhat intractable housing shortage right now, and also has a lot of deferred maintenance and construction needs in several realms, but notably including schools. So there are, coming from different quarters, this same question about other, other big spending items do come in. That committee process, made a recommendation, for example, last year of a prudent borrowing level for the state of $54 million a year. And, partly as a result of that process, we have a very low cost of borrowing. We have a very good credit rating and good standing with the rating agencies. So one of the major considerations with anything like this, any of these sort of, you think about like a housing moonshot bond, or a climate bond, is the impact on that rating and our cost of capital, and those are pretty durable effects. So those are things that the committee and the treasurer think about very carefully. But certainly climate is one of the and sort of infrastructure broadly is one of the things that states bond for. Obviously, I would say we're a bit more limited in our ability to do it than California, to maybe understate it a little bit, but definitely something that is on our radar.
And then one follow-up and additional question for you, Gavin, before we move to Ed, is in the first panel this morning with the staff from our congressional delegation, I think the number one message received was get your federal grants allocated or obligated as soon as possible. And a number of folks who are working on projects at the municipal level had questions around technical assistance availability. So there was a specific question for you about the municipal technical assistance program out of the treasurer's office. Is there an opportunity to expand that for the next 7 weeks to focus on helping those unobligated IRA funds get obligated? Sorry, I put you on the spot, but it's a top question.
It's fine. I probably put myself there, and maybe wrongly so. The Municipal Technical Assistance Program is not run out of our office. We've just advocated for funding it. This is definitely something I'll take back and raise. But I don't have anything, and I don't know that Julie would either. If whoever asked that question, feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'll see what I can unearth and get done.
Yeah, I think the existing funding, so the Municipal Technical Assistance Program is run out of the Chief Recovery Officer's office, Doug Farnham. He had an initial allocation of, I think, $3.5 million, but I think that has been fully committed at this point. Yeah. And I believe we'll have to wait for the legislature to return to sort of refill that pot.
Thank you. So on to Chair McNamara. There's a couple of, I think, related questions here. One of the ones at the top is about, I think, a couple on the thermal energy benefits charge proposed by the PUC. Can you talk about how that would compare to a clean heat standard in terms of helping heating fuel companies diversify their services and products? And then also a question about the thermal energy benefits charge and how that would relate to the concerns you raised around regressivity as a lens in how you look at effects on ratepayers in the electric sector, concerns about potential regressivity on fossil fuel customers. A couple of related questions there on the thermal energy benefits charge proposal.
Great, thanks. With respect to helping fuel dealers diversify the product, yeah, I've heard that before, and I've never heard it from a fuel dealer. I've heard it from sort of the Montpelier bubble, but nowhere else. And so I think that is, quite honestly, the fuel dealers are diversifying on their own. The larger ones, the smaller ones aren't able to do it. So you're going to get a stratification regardless of whether it's a clean heat standard, a thermal energy benefit charge, or something else. The ones that are interested in diversifying will do it regardless of the mechanism. And the ones that simply are unable, the one person with a truck is likely to either, under this clean heat standard, just pay the DDA, which is the out and doesn't help diversify at all, or I'll just leave it at that. So yeah, I don't see either clean heat or thermal energy benefit charge one way or the other impacting diversification. To the extent that folks want to think about longer term transition, I think, quite honestly, thermal energy benefit charge and taking some of that money and then giving it to Department of Labor for retraining, for ensuring that we have adequate workforce for installing heat pumps and for for weatherization, that's probably a simpler mechanism in the longer term. With respect to thermal energy benefit charge and regressivity, I think either thermal energy benefit charge or clean heat standard, they're both regressive. I mean, when you think about sort of the regulatory structure, we think about it as really costs staying within the overall sector. Both clean heat standard and thermal energy benefit charge, costs are all within the sector. And that usually means that it's sort of the cost causer pays, and at the end of the day, it's customers who end up paying the cost. Unless you use general fund money, some kind of progressive tax, I don't see how you get around that. Within both clean heat standard and sort of thermal energy benefit charge, you can also set up programs so that you provide more incentives for low income Vermonters. I believe VGS and Efficiency Vermont and Burlington Electric already do that as well. They do that currently. And then obviously weatherization assistance providers are doing that. So if we're taking money and spending or diverting most of that to low income weatherization, that's the way to get around the regressivity.
Thanks, Ed. So for the top question that's come in for you, Secretary Moore, is that since it appears that the administration will not support the clean heat standard, can you speak to the alternatives that are being proposed that would have an equivalent impact that would be supported by you or the administration?
I think I don't want to get out in front of the legislature here. Like the ball is in their court in terms of looking at the clean heat standard and evaluating whether or not it makes sense to move forward. And so developing or putting forward an alternative proposal until a final decision is reached on the one that's currently in front of us, or perhaps the two that are currently in front of us, if folks are interested in taking up the PUC's suggestion, is an important one. I do think there's a hard conversation that needs to be had about 2030. I think part of the challenge around the clean heat standard is not the clean heat standard itself. I give great weight to the concerns Ed raised about its administrative complexity, but frankly, the cost driver is the 2030 reduction requirement it's been designed to reach. The same is going to be true of a cap and invest program. I don't think, based on our analysis, even if we jumped right into WCI with both feet, we would meet the 2030 reductions requirement under a cap and invest strategy. There's certainly other rules that could be put into place, but the fact of the matter is, are we trying to come up with something that's long-term sustainable and achieves decarbonization by 2050? or are we trying to reach the 2030 requirement? And I think there's some hard conversations that had to be had, and that's kind of why I left with those closing thoughts, is just thinking about how we get to something that's durable, sustainable, enjoys broad-based public support, and I'm not sure we have that thing in front of us yet.
Thanks. A follow-up question, Secretary Moore, that was specifically addressed to you that came in was, given the observation that the Climate Action Plan recommendations feel like spaghetti at the wall, which of the multiple options would the administration support?
Well, there's a wide variety of things in there, right? Those 260 recommendations include things, everything from initially adopting the clean car and clean truck standards, to some of the things that were taken up as part of the Flood Safety Act, to ensuring food security for all Vermonters, to promoting compact settlement and making acceptable investments or necessary investments in water and sewer necessary to support those types of development patterns. I think part of the challenge is trying to intuit the broader public's priorities from a very comprehensive list. We certainly picked and moved forward with a handful of those things. The one that we were directed to do explicitly was to adopt clean car and clean truck standards, so that naturally took the pole position in our work following the adoption of the Climate Action Plan in 2021. But beyond that, I think Jared can attest to this in his capacity as a climate counselor, it was really hard. We have people that are experts in thinking about agriculture and ecosystems, and asking them then to prioritize initiatives related to rural resilience or initiatives related to greenhouse gas emissions becomes very challenging. And I think that's part of where we found ourselves stuck. There's work been done in each of those spaces. We've compiled sort of a status report on each of the actions, and I think it's available on the Climate Action Office website if folks are interested in taking a look at it. But this is complicated and multifaceted work that touches every aspect of, I would say, our modern lives. And it is really hard to start to tease out priorities and feel like you're not leaving something that's also important behind.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll go back to the start of the panel order for a couple questions that have come in for you, Gavin. Is the Treasurer's Office communicating with or working with the new green banks that have been created federally? And what should Vermont know, or what can we learn from the creation of that green bank model?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are certainly trying to learn from other green banks. There are green banks in states other than Vermont. One view of the 2.5% for climate initiative is that it stood up a very lean green bank inside the Treasurer's Office, and capitalized it with that percentage of the state's cash balance. So I would say that, before advocating for that, we looked at other green banks, how they were capitalized, how much administrative overhead there was. And part of the 2.5% effort was to minimize administrative overhead, acknowledge that we're a small state, and to reach a level of capital that was sort of a scale with other green banks. I mean, I always hesitate to cite figures from memory, but I believe, like, Connecticut, for example, I think has capitalized a green bank with about $150 million. So if you think of us, we have arguably capitalized ours with authority to lend up to about 30 or 40 million. That's probably, of a scale or even slightly larger per capita than Connecticut's effort. We don't have day-to-day interaction with those other green banks, but certainly open to learning from them and interested in that, and have already taken some lessons from them.
And before we go to Ed, one directly related follow-up is this question: is there room possibly to increase the 2.5% for climate from the Treasurer's Office to a higher percentage, especially given the possible or likely reductions in federal funding?
Yeah, so the simple answer is yes. The legislature could do that. I think, in our conversations with other treasurers' offices nationwide about lending programs like this, and bear in mind that, we have the 10% program as well. Most states really max out at sort of 10 to 15% of cash balance as being available for lending. So we would want to take a pretty close look at our capacity. And the other aspect of that is as we get closer to that sort of prudent percentage maximum, I think one of the other questions raised highlighted that our cash balances are likely to drop. We have modeled that. We anticipate that they are probably going to drop to around 1 billion rather than the sort of 1.6, 1.7 that they're at right now, as we spend down all the federal dollars that came post-pandemic. So those percentages, we've taken a conservative approach to taking a percentage of the 1.7 or the 2.5, which it was last year, in light of those future projections already. So, I think it's certainly an interesting idea and one to think about, but one that I think we would just want to scrutinize pretty closely.
Thank you. And so I think we've got time for a couple of more questions. The top one that has come in, I think, directed for you, Chair McNamara, is can you speak to how will the new renewable energy standard change the Public Utility Commission's approach to solar and wind?
Yeah, I guess I'm hesitating because I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I'm not sure it does actually affect anything. Utilities are obligated to go out and procure either through long-term contracts, build their own resources, and I don't see how that impacts the siting, other than we are going to have more siting cases, most likely, because of the doubling of Tier 2. Other than that, I'm actually not really seeing any change.
Okay. Let me follow up with one more specific question directed to you, Chair McNamara, and that is the PUC, or I guess are you, given that you, I know, will not speak for your fellow commissioners, interested in performance-based regulation tied specifically to climate obligations?
In general, performance-based regulation can be extremely helpful. It's an incredibly broad category of what performance-based regulation actually is. The energy efficiency utilities are actually under performance-based mechanism. They get certain incentives depending on how well they do meeting their goals. So it just, yes, I'll say yes with a big caveat of it entirely depends on what that looks like.
Thanks. Okay, so this may be a question for either you, Secretary Moore, or you may want to address it as well, Chair McNamara, and that is how does the Agency of Natural Resources or the Public Utility Commission expect to incorporate the social cost of greenhouse gases in decision-making and permitting?
That is not something we have contemplated at this point. I'm trying to think how that would work in a lot of our regulatory decisions that are very sort of media-based, and particularly most of our regulatory, or the lion's share of our regulatory programs, draw their authorities from the Clean Water Act. So stormwater, wastewater, as well as the Safe Drinking Water Act. I can give that more thought, but I don't have an immediate reaction.
Yeah, so just a little bit of a history lesson. Prior to 2015, there was no renewable energy standard. We used to do, the PUC used to do, require every electric utility to do an integrated resource plan. And in that, we would look at ask the utilities or tell the utilities, you need to look at the social cost of carbon. You need to actually compare different generation sources. Now the legislature has told the utilities, this is what your power supply mix is effectively going to be. It's going to be, 20% solar and or small scale hydro. It's going to be X percent. And so that is largely driving the power supply procurement. So social cost of carbon, I think, doesn't really factor into the siting. Utilities have to go out and get a certain amount of in-state solar, or they have to get a certain amount of other resources. And it's the legislative res requirements that are actually driving that rather than the social cost of carbon.
All right, and the last question, which I assume is primarily for Secretary Moore, but others may want to address, given the likelihood of more extreme weather events occurring, is what work is happening to stand up a staff of case managers to help victims of flooding and other disasters?
Yeah, so the case managers tend to sit with the Agency of Human Services as opposed to the Agency of Natural Resources, and Jason Goslin is their emergency management lead, so would defer to him. I would say, the place where we see the most emergency response work being done by the agency in the immediate aftermath of a flood event is through our team of river engineers, and have done some cross-training with other staff with relevant expertise, as well as built a really strong set of partnerships with the Agency of Transportation so that we are able to get folks out on the ground helping restore connectivity and hopefully do it in a way that it'll hold up at least for the near term and doesn't do more environmental damage. And so, we have a team of 5 river engineers, about an equal number of additional staff who've had training in that space, that have deployed each of the last 2 summers and spent essentially, I saw the chief engineer this morning actually, and he told me it was his first day in the office in months, have spent all their time in the field providing field advice, handwritten permits. We call them emergency protective measures, and allow that work to proceed. But in terms of people who've lost their homes in particular, making those sorts of sort of human services arrangements is all coordinated through AHS and Jason Goslin's team.
Well, thank you all very much for your work, your service to Vermont and Vermonters, and for taking the time to join this panel. And thank you all for the questions you submitted. We got through a number of them. Unfortunately, I think there's still like 18 in the list, in the queue that we didn't get to. But I know that at least multiple folks on this panel have said they're planning to stick around for the rest of the afternoon. What we are moving into now is a break before our third and final panel. So we've got a break until 2:10, until 10 after 2, when we'll come back for our legislative leaders panel. During that time, feel free to try to catch some of our panelists to ask the questions that we didn't get to from Slido, or maybe get a cup of tea or coffee. And then one more request, which is, I see more Post-its populating those flip charts in the back. But just to really reiterate what Cara said earlier, which is your feedback will be incredibly valuable to us. We're going to move right out of this summit into a debrief of EIN's work in 2024 and looking ahead to 2025 work planning. So if you have suggestions for additional or updated research and data analysis, for ways that we can help facilitate collaboration on important projects or topics across the network, please fill out those Post-it notes or upvote ones that you think we should focus on. That will be very helpful to us, and we'll report out on some of what you've said that we should consider working on together towards the end of the day. Thank you very much.